size does matter. Hi everyone, Roxanne here from FinanceRocks.com. Today I'm going to share how to avoid the biggest emergency fund mistakes. I'll share the 8 common mistakes that I've observed people making, whether that is family members, friends, or my personal coaching clients, or honestly, just mistakes that I've made with my emergency fund. Stay tuned for the end of this video where I will share how many of the 8 mistakes I've made, and I'll go through which ones I have and haven't made. And I would love it if you would drop the number of mistakes that you've made out of these in the comment section below. I just think it'd be really interesting to see, and you guys can help me feel better because I've made quite a few of these. Now, none of us should feel bad about making mistakes with our emergency funds as long as we learn from them and take the actions necessary to not make the same mistakes again. It's impossible for us to know what emergencies are going to come up for us. It's impossible to prepare for every kind of emergency. We just have to do the best that we can and accept that there's going to be risks that we're not going to be prepared for. Let's jump into those mistakes now. Big mistake number 1 is not having a big enough emergency fund or having no emergency fund. But the size of your emergency fund matters. So size matters when it comes to your emergency fund. Really, the reason that it matters is because it's the only thing standing between you and financial chaos and stress. Now, it's no secret that a lot of Americans struggle to save an emergency fund. And you know, there's a lot of reasons behind this, right? It might be not having a high enough income, too much debt, and paying too much money towards interest expense every month. So that's money that they otherwise would have been able to save. Or I'm going to talk about one of the psychological reasons that I think a lot of people don't save enough, which is this sense that they're invincible. Now, I used to think that this was just a young people thing, but I've seen it more and more, and I think it really is an everybody kind of problem. And I saw it just recently. So one of my clients had recently had surgery and was looking to move and said that they were going to prioritize having a comfortable apartment, which means more than the average cost for an apartment in their area. They were going to prioritize the apartment above replenishing their emergency fund. That kind of surprised me because, you know, she had just had surgery. I thought she was going to be like, okay, let's not have this happen again. Let's get the emergency fund filled up. She wasn't. And, you know, when I asked her about it, she said that, you know, what else can happen now? I just went through all this, like, it's unlikely that another thing will happen to me. And while that may be true, the statistics say that emergencies happen to all of us and frequently, especially financial emergencies, right? It can be your car dying or job loss and, you know, pandemics, for example. My first tip for you for how to avoid this mistake would be this mantra that I use a lot, which is the statistics apply to me. I read this article one time that was talking about how people often don't believe that statistics apply to them, that they're different, that their scenario is unique. You know, they don't really believe that the statistics apply to them. And it was particularly interesting because they talked about newlyweds. They, you know, would tell newlyweds, you know, there's a 50-50 chance of divorce. Even after hearing that, newlyweds would say there was a 0% chance that they would get divorced, or maybe like a 10% chance that they would get divorced. Even for me, it's a little hard to say, yeah, it's a 50-50 chance that my husband and I would get divorced. But I just have to brace it and say my mantra again, statistics apply to me. And the benefit of saying that statistics apply to me, allow me to actually think through scenarios that might happen that could cause that outcome that I don't want, and then be prepared for it. You know, it helps me to not take my relationship with my husband for granted. It helps me to save a full, proper emergency fund because I know that statistically, emergencies happen and they will happen to me. So that's just my little mantra that I use to help me to be realistic about whether or not I need an emergency fund. The other thing I'll say is to save more in good times. Especially growing up, I noticed that people would spend money when they had it. At the time, seems fine, right? Like you have money, you have income coming in, so there's money that you can spend. But then, they'd lose their job or have to move to a new place, and then they wouldn't have any income and they wouldn't have had any money saved. So just pushing yourself a little bit farther during good times and just pushing yourself to save a little bit more when money is abundant is going to help you to have more emergency funds when you need them. The second mistake that I see people making is rating their savings. Now, I consider this to be anytime you are accessing your emergency fund for reasons other than what you initially set the money aside for. So it might be things like pulling money out of your death fund or job loss fund because you've had a car breakdown. I do recommend having a separate fund. I like to call it like a common shortage fund, specifically for like car breakdowns. So I consider that to be rating your savings. I also consider it to be rating your savings if you straight up buy something with that money that is just a non-essential. However, most of the time that I see people do this, it is, for things that they actually need and just didn't have enough money set aside. The other really big thing that I've seen people do with like rating their savings is loaning their emergency funds to family members. So let me tell you a little story. When I was in like middle school, my mom had this friend. She was just so cool. She had like leather jackets and drove a motorcycle, and she could play the piano. She taught me how to play a little bit. And I just thought that she was just so fierce and independent and awesome. The last time that I remember seeing her, actually, she came over to our house and she was just sobbing. She told us that she had given her emergency fund to her brother. I think she technically called it like extra money, or, said that she had been helping him out for a while. And now she had lost her job and couldn't pay her rent, and her brother couldn't pay her back. And it makes sense, right? If you have extra money just sitting in your bank account and you have a family member that's struggling, it makes sense to just say, here, you can have this. You need it more than I do. And I think a lot of people are very generous and kind-hearted like that. And I've seen this a lot, but with other people as well. And it's good, right? It's that kind and generous spirit. I really admire it. But in this case, it had wrecked this lady's finances. If you can establish boundaries around your emergency fund and grow it and, get your finances in proper order, then you can do so much more and be so much more generous and actually give money that you can afford to give instead of money that you need for your emergency fund. It can be so hard to say no when those situations come up, but I just always would tell myself, it's no for now. When I get my stuff in order, I'm going to be there for you. So here's my advice on how to avoid this mistake. Be generous to yourself. Honor the intentions for the money that you have set aside or money that you are currently saving out of your income for your emergencies. The other piece of advice that I would give you would be to kill that money. Like, it's money, yes, you have it, but you don't really. So I like to think of it as like, it's dead to me. It's not really there. I can't actually access it. And this kind of ties into my like emergency fund for your emergency fund for your emergency fund theory, where like you have different layers of money for different things. And so then you can say, this emergency fund is protecting this one, which is protecting this one, differentiating those funds instead of just looking at, here's the money that I have. Big mistake number 3, failing to reevaluate your emergency fund as your life circumstances change. One of the great things about life is that it does always change. We always do have new challenges or new opportunities. You don't want to set your emergency fund based on one set of monthly expenses and then never reevaluate that amount. If you have a job change and you're making more money or less money, either way, if your income changes and that affects your spending, if you have a new house or new family member, or if you have the declining health of existing family members, whatever circumstances are changing, that should impact how much you have for your emergency fund. Now, I did a whole video on how much money you should have in each of the 5 types of funds that I keep. So if you're trying to figure out still how much money to set aside for emergencies, that would be a resource I would point you to. My how-to tip for you on this is simply to set a calendar reminder to go off once per year on the same day every year that just says, hey, do you need more money in your emergency fund? And just use that as a trigger to, think through, okay, what's changed since last year? Do I need more money set aside than I currently have? Big mistake number 4, having a low standard for your emergency fund. Everyone wants to have a big, beautiful, fully funded emergency fund. There's a big difference between saying that you want to have X number of dollars in your emergency fund and saying that you have to have X number of dollars in your emergency fund. Now, you should have a goal for your emergency fund. Like, I want to have this amount of money, and that's great, and that's good to aspire to and work towards. But you should also have the number identified that's your bare minimum. No matter what, you're willing and committed to keeping that amount of money in your emergency fund at all times. When I had $200 to my name, I set the standard for myself that I need to always have at least $1,000 in my account at all times. And having that boundary set with myself that I have to always have this, it triggered me to take action where wanting to have an emergency fund didn't. It helped me to actually go out there, conquer my anxiety about getting hired in a town where I didn't know anybody. That is what really got me to the point where I could save that emergency fund. So my tip for you has 2 parts. The first is identify where your standard is now. Apparently mine was like $200. If I needed to have 200, it might be $0. It might be $0 and credit cards maxed out. But identify whatever that threshold is for you right now where you're like, oh shit, I need to take action. And then increase that a little bit and have a new mantra like, okay, I have to always have 1,000, or I have to always have 1,500, or I have to always have 2,000. Whatever like the next increment is for you, set that as, your new have to have. And then, as you approach that number, remind yourself of that little mantra, I have to always have. Big mistake number 5. If I have more than $1,000, I'll spend it. I had a client say this to me one time, and right away my brain said, well, if you can never have more than $1,000, you're never going to be able to build a proper emergency fund or any kind of wealth for that matter. Everyone has a different threshold for what they consider to be a lot of money. So I encourage you to think about what that threshold is for you. It might be $1,000, it might be less or more. Identifying, what number feels like a lot of money to you. And then once again, my advice is going to be to do the same thing, which is increase that in small increments over time. So my client would then say, if I have more than $1,500, I'll spend it. If I have more than $2,000, I'll spend it. It's unrealistic to expect ourselves to just throw that idea out the window that I'm just going to not spend money that I consider to be a lot of money. So I find that just increasing that in small increments is helpful instead of just, saying, oh, well, what can I do? That seems like a lot of money to me. And you can actually give yourself permission to spend that money. Maybe you maintain that level for a little while and then you say, oh, okay, I'm going to increase it again now because I've built the discipline to not spend that money above 1,000. Big mistake number 6, keeping your emergency fund in a low interest savings account. When you're first starting out, it really doesn't matter if you keep your emergency funds in a low interest savings account because the amount of interest that you would make anyway is going to be small and immaterial. But as your emergency fund grows, I recommend looking into different types of savings accounts where you can make more interest on that money. For example, most traditional banks have like 0.01% interest on most savings accounts, which is like nothing. I prefer to use high yield savings accounts, preferably with like online banks because then they don't have the overhead that traditional banks have of having a brick and mortar location. And I also like to use CDs for saving money too. Now, people have given me a hard time before about keeping money in CDs, but I'll say this. Right now, our CDs are like the only thing that are making any kind of money, thanks coronavirus. Now, it's a trade-off here. I really like to optimize our finances and try to make as much money with the money that we have as possible, trying to, get good returns on the money that we've already made because that helps grow wealth. So optimizers, I hear you. I hear that you don't like to keep money in CDs or savings accounts. But it is worth it to me to have that money readily available in case of an emergency, and I'm willing to pay that price of lower interest. Even though we've always kept a pretty high percentage of our net worth in liquid types of accounts, we still are on track to hit our retirement number at age 39. So really, I just am not that concerned about missing out on a few points of interest on our emergency funds. And this pandemic is a great example of a time where I wouldn't have wanted our emergency funds to be invested in the market. You don't want to have to pull money out when the market's down and potentially lose principal. Big mistake number 7, relying solely on credit cards as an emergency fund. Now, when I had only $200, I was very afraid of running out of money. So I did go and sign up for my very first credit card, because then at least I had that balance that I could fall back on if I absolutely needed to. This is a really slippery slope. You sign up for a credit card so that you have cash available, but then that can snowball and get out of control where you then have a bunch of high interest rate debt, no way to pay it. Like, that's a fast track to bankruptcy. My experience with debt has been negative. I was always really uncomfortable with the idea of having debt because I saw firsthand that the only thing worse than having no money is having negative money. I really didn't want that scenario to happen. I was lucky that after I signed up for the card, I got hired right away and was able to save up money for the emergency fund. So I did not ever use that card. It eventually just got canceled due to inactivation. And certainly my experience with credit cards has been negative. There are people that leverage debt and have it pay off for them, and it's fine. And so, certainly that's the case. It's a personal decision. For me, though, I didn't want to use debt as an emergency fund. So how to avoid this if you're also trying to avoid that situation? I would say to stop thinking of it as an emergency fund. Certainly just that little mindset tweak. And I know it's scary because you're like, there's nothing else. What else am I going to do if I'm out of money? But that triggers that conversation. Why did this happen? What can I change in my life for this to not happen again, and to how to get out of this situation? So this is really more of a mindset change than anything. Big mistake number 8. I consider this to be the biggest mistake that most people make, which is not putting enough why behind your emergency funds. Emergency funds are like goals. Every goal that you have should have a powerful and emotional, specific why behind it, because that helps motivate you to keep going through hard times towards that goal. And emergency funds are the same. Every emergency fund should have a specific, emotional, powerful why behind it, so that way you'll keep saving even though you are working a lot of hours and getting tired, or cutting back on expenses, and that's emotionally draining. It's going to keep you motivated to keep saving money, and it's also going to keep you motivated to keep that money once you have it. So let me ask you this. What's more motivating? Having $1,000 for emergencies, or having $950 set aside in case your youngest brother suffers a head injury from skateboarding and ends up in a hospital in Seattle? Thinking about my brother being in the hospital was so motivating to me. And even after I had built my emergency fund, like I said, thinking of him being in the hospital would pop into my mind if I ever thought about spending that money on non-emergencies or even less serious emergencies. And that's how I was able to separate that death fund that I keep and talk about from like a common shortage fund. I have a whole video about the 5 types of emergency funds that I keep, where I talk about my why statements behind each one. I'll go ahead and link that in the comments in the description below. So that's all 8. Okay. Truth time. Truth time here. How many of these 8 mistakes have I made? 6. I made 6 of them. I made not enough, certainly. I only had $200. That's not a proper emergency fund by anybody's estimation. Rating your emergency fund, this is one that I consider that I haven't ever done. Once I set that, standard for myself of $1,000 and I'm never going to touch that money, I have honestly been able to keep that. And I think it is because, like I said, the serious nature of it, putting strong why behind it, broken unemployed really shook me. Failure to reevaluate your emergency fund amount. Yes, I'm guilty of that. Not always looked at it on a consistent basis. I have set the reminder for annual check-ins on reevaluating. So that's two of the mistakes that I've made. The next one, low standards. I am guilty of that. Having low standards. I, didn't really have any. My standard was 0, essentially, if I run out of money, which I hadn't realized, but that was my standard. If I have more than $1,000, I'll spend it. Now, this is one that I don't think that I really have made before. I specifically remember the first time my account hit $20,000 thinking like, holy crap, that's a lot of money. And I know that's not a lot of money for everybody, but just thinking, holy crap, that's a lot of money. I could spend some money if I wanted to. I remember having that thought, but then I was so excited about having hit such a big number that my spending didn't change at all. I didn't feel tempted to spend any of that money after that initial thought of, whoa, that's a lot. Low interest savings, guilty there. Had a 0.01% savings account for many years. And like I said, it doesn't really matter that much when you don't have a lot in emergency funds, but we had it too long. We should have upgraded to a high yield savings account way earlier. Relying solely on credit cards as an emergency fund. I think I did mention this, but I am guilty of that one. It was better than nothing at the time, and that's a tough one. And then not having enough why behind my emergency funds. I think that's what got me in this situation in the first place, where I was broken unemployed, not having specific reasons that I could focus on to actually save and keep money. I'm interested to hear, how many of these emergency fund mistakes have you made? If you got value from this video and want to be alerted when I publish my next videos, I publish every Friday. Feel free to subscribe below and click the bell to be notified of new videos. That's all I have for you today. Until next time, I hope your finances rock. The other piece I have it's hailing right now. It just started hailing. Rude.